Now, I would be very pleased to be introducing Bernd Lenzner, who's a person whose papers I have read intermittently for many years, actually, because we have strong overlay interests around invasive species and biological questions arising around biological invasions. He's a macroecologist based at the University of Vienna, University of Vienna, all of a sudden, and has specialized in large-scale questions around global ecology, invasive species biology, and has most recently published this paper that we'll be discussing around European colonialism and its impacts on global biodiversity. We had a little quick chat beforehand. Bernd also told me that he's actually looking into the future. We've just actually seen the latest IPCC report, which is not good. And one of the impacts of environmental and climate change is also interlaid and interplayed with invasive species biology. So looking into the future and actually assessing invasive species impacts in the future will be very important. So I welcome and thank Bernd for his talk. Please begin, Bernd.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks everyone for being here. It's such a privilege to be invited by the Linnean Society to talk about my publication and some of my work around this. Yes, I think the background of the first slide already sets the tone. It's a very nice painting of the palm house at Royal Botanical Gardens Kew, which I guess most of you are familiar with. And as the title says, we're talking about the impact of European colonialism on global plant redistributions. But I'm not only going to talk about these publications, but I will talk a bit about the definition of non-native species, so talk about briefly on the terminology, so we're all on the same page, and about neophytes today, so non-native plant distributions globally and work we've done on that, to then look back on the European expansion and its influence on species redistribution. Then we'll talk a bit about the legacy of these European empires on today's floras, which relates very much to the publication that Mark just mentioned. And then I will end with some concluding remarks on that. So to get this started, briefly on terminology, I guess most of you are familiar with this anyways, given your interest in plants and botany. So if we're talking about non-native species, we have a species here in green in the native range, and this species can be transported to its so-called non-native range, so outside its natural distribution area, native range, and this generally is done through human agency, and the species then appears in this non-native range. We call it then in the first stage as an introduced non-native species, which are generally those that are not able to survive without care or that do not reproduce in the wild. So often these are horticultural plants that are not winter hardy, species in parks, public green spaces, those that might be there for a while but then disappear on its own. If species then move into the wild, into natural habitats, we call them established or naturalized non-native species. So those are the ones in natural habitats that are able to have self-reproducing populations and which we experience if we're out on a stroll, for example. And then we have this last group of invasive non-native species, which they're normally called, which are species that have a strong ability to spread in natural habitats, and species that can inflict negative ecological or socioeconomic impacts. And this depends a bit on the definition you're using and the context. And this also is the smallest fraction of non-native species in total. When I was invited by the Linnean Society, I, of course, as well looked at the website with great interest and found a lot of super interesting information. And I also found these very nicely designed Christmas cards, and one that of course took my attention was this very nice card of poinsettia. Even though it's not Christmas, I think it's a very nice example of a non-native species, which is a characteristic floral display we use in Christmas, so which we've included into our daily lives and traditions, but actually it is an indigenous one to Mexico and Central America, which has first been described by Europeans in 1834. Yeah, so I think this was quite a nice small anecdote or find on the webpage. But even though some of these species we include very prominently in our daily lives, also invasive species are often associated with other impacts. Then we're often or generally referring to invasive alien plants. And as we can see here in these different news headlines from The Guardian, for example, is that we have species spreading and distributed globally very prominently, having impacts on economics, on human livelihoods and biodiversity. And as this last headline shows, this is a pattern or a phenomenon that occurs all across the world. So this is really a global phenomenon. We normally talk about globalization. In most instances, we talk about the interconnection of the globe. So often thinking about the human dimension of interconnections. Here you can see, for example, the flight and shipment connections of the world in this very impressive map. Looking at this network, we see that it's obvious that plants can travel also across the globe with humans, with commodities and our actions. If we're looking at globalization from the point of view of plants, the world looks a bit different. This is a world map of based on the Global Naturalized Alien Floras database, scientific project I've been working on for the last 7 years already. What you can see here is the number of established non-native plants in different regions of the world. So these are political delineations at the country or at the subnational level, also for islands. And we already see that this is quite a big global phenomenon. And we see already some hot spots where we find a lot of naturalized non-native plants worldwide. To put this into context and give you some figures here, globally, approximately 13,000 non-native plants or neophytes are recorded or reported, which is roughly 4% of all known plants, or in maybe a more easy to grasp figure, it's approximately the size of the European flora. Most of these neophytes are found in Northern America, around 6,000 species, and in Europe, around 4,000 species, which already gives a bit of an indication that this might be some kind of legacy or heritage from European colonial expansion. Also, most neophytes are distributed in coastal regions and on islands. And just to give a short figure here, this is based on a study we did on the GLONAF database, where we looked on these classical island biogeographic patterns, which we know from native plants, that species richness decreases with isolation, which we see here on the x-axis. If we're looking at alien or non-native plant richness on islands, tropical and subtropical islands in particular, we see an inversion of this trend. So we see high numbers of alien non-native plants on very remote islands because humans have broken down this dispersal barrier here. Also, if we're looking at geographic patterns, we see that neophytes mainly originate from temperate Asia. So here in green, we can see the outgoing flows to other regions of the world. So most of the non-native naturalized flora comes from temperate Asia and from Europe. So if we keep on with the globalization from the point of view of plants, we can also look at patterns of taxonomic homogenization. Here's a little cartoon to illustrate this, which shows here a flora of a region A and the flora of region B and C, so two different countries, for example, and the colored species represent individual plant species in these regions. If we have exchange between these regions, so if we have, for example, the of non-native plants or the exchange of non-native plants between these regions, those floras might become more similar because they're exchanging species that might establish in these regions. And so some of these regions become a bit less similar and others more similar, depending on the amount of species that they are exchanging and the characteristics of these regions. Of course, native species might be replaced or locally become locally extinct, which can either further increase or decrease the similarity between these regions. We looked at this in a very interesting study led by Qiang Yang as well, based on the GLONASS data, where he looked at homogenization, taxonomic homogenization between regions of the world. And here is the main figure or the world map of the study, where we can see here in these yellow to green colors the similarity of the global floras, taking into account the native and non-native plants in these regions. And the similarity increases with these darker green colors. We see here again, we see a high degree of homogenizations, especially in these temperate regions. But we also see that in all these regions that we are looking at, we see an increase in the similarity of the floras globally. Also, what Qiang and what we found in this study was that well-established patterns in native species, like the distance decay, where the taxonomic similarity between regions decreases sharply with geographic distance, becomes more relaxed or weakened if we take into account naturalized floras of these regions. So this distance decay pattern is weakened through the exchange or by the introduction of non-native plants. Some of you might have read this or might be familiar with this term. So the Homogenocene, so it's used in similar contexts like the Anthropocene, where humans are the dominating forces of the world. The Homogenocene takes a bit more the angle from the biological or biodiversity point of view in many instances, which basically means we're in a kind of state where we are homogenizing local floras, biodiversity, but also social and cultural aspects of the world. Another point I want to make here in this initial part on the current distribution of plants, of non-native plants, is looking at the driver of non-native plant redistributions. And those that have been identified as most important are related to trade and transport. So the movement of goods and commodities, also socioeconomic development of regions increase or are generally associated with an increase of naturalized non-native plants. Also population density, tourism, so are linked to the redistribution of species deliberately or undeliberately. Also population density as a proxy for the amount of disturbance by humans in nature. Then we have indirect drivers, climate or climate change, land use, land cover change, which are very strongly associated with an increase of non-native plants globally. And also colonial history, which is the focus of this talk today. As a last example at this global scale today, I want to talk a bit about a very nice publication by Nogue et al. In Science, which appeared last year, 2 years ago, where they looked at pollen from sediment cores on islands worldwide. And what you can see here on the y-axis is always the compositional turnover in plant pollen. And on the x-axis, you can see the temporal dimension from 5,000 years before today until today. And what we can see here in these horizontal lines, we see that there is very little compositional turnover. And if this line here shifts to an increase, we see that there is quite a lot of compositional turnover in the pollen we find in these sediment cores. And what we can see is in many instances, this coincides with this yellow line that we see in the graphs. And this yellow line indicates the recorded human arrival on these islands. So the moment when people appear on the scene, the plant world seems to change on islands. In a follow-up study with work done by Anna Valentowicz, where we were involved, we looked also on the amount of native and non-native pollen taxa in these cores. And what we can see here, again, exemplary for Flourish and São Nicolau, we see an increase in the percentage of non-native pollen after human arrival on these islands. The study is about to be published in the coming days. It has been accepted some weeks ago. So I invite you to check this out when it will be released soon. So moving from this more recent or current patterns of non-native plant distributions, we can of course ask the question, what dynamics did the European expansion set in motion, as this is the topic of this talk today. I will walk you through some of these parts today. If we're talking about non-native plants or neophytes, you're often confronted with 1492 as a date to define neophytes, and which is generally perceived as the onset of a fully globalized world. And this, of course, coincides with the voyages of Christopher Columbus, who did in total 4 different voyages to the Western Hemisphere. The first one here indicated in red line. So this is generally perceived as the onset of a truly globalized world and truly globalized exchange of commodities, species, and people. And if we are looking at this very nice representation of the global shipping or trading network in the seminal work by De Castri, we can see the shipping network in 1500, which is very much focused still on Central Europe, the Mediterranean. But if we're looking at this network in 1775, we see that this has shifted to a really truly globally connected world, which of course was increased, or which of course was strengthened due to the actions that followed the European expansions with the establishment of different trading companies like the British East India Company in 1600, one of the largest corporations in the world back then, with a focus on India and Hong Kong, or the Dutch East India Trading Company, which dominated the spice trade for quite a long time, but also looking towards the West with the Dutch West India Company, the French West India Company, who were very much involved in setting up these global trade networks back in the day. What consequences did this globalized world pose? A term that you've probably all heard and are familiar with is the so-called Columbian exchange. Just to reiterate this quickly, it relates to the large-scale exchange of plants, animals, diseases, goods, and people between the Eastern and Western Hemisphere. And you can see this in this illustration here on the right hand. This was an exchange in both directions. Just some examples for species from the New World traded during this Columbian exchange. You can see maize, tomatoes, potatoes, gum tree, cocoa, tobacco. Here we have some nice illustrations of maize and potatoes here. But also in the other directions, some examples, mainly apple, banana, but also onion, or as you can see in the pictures, wheat species or rice. As you might already get from the selection here of examples, initially this trade was very much dominated by economically useful plants that were moved between the hemispheres. So obviously one of the main reasons to exchange plants back in the day were the exploration of new food sources. For example, potato, Solanum tuberosum, originally from South America, which was introduced to the Canaries in 1560 and had its earliest proof of introduction to Spain, so to mainland Europe, in 1570. The potato, we all know it, very important in Europe, especially as a food resource following 30 Years' War, so in the end of the 17th century, but also an important crop to reduce the huge consequences of the famine in Ireland in the mid-19th century, where due to the import of the potato blight, Phytophthora infestans in 1842, the production of potato collapsed, leading to a population decline in Ireland of almost 12%, so with about 1 million people dying from this famine. Also, the exploration or the search for new medicinal plants was very much on top of the agenda. Here you can see a depiction of quinine, or the Jesuit's bark, Cinchona officinalis, which was a very important, or the most important medicinal plant back in the day. It's called Jesuit's bark because it was discovered by Spanish Jesuit missionaries in the early 17th century, and it's native to the West Indies, mainly to the Peru area. In 1630, the missionaries treated the Countess of Chinchon, wife of the Spanish viceroy in Lima, of her malaria illness, and this also became the reason for the name of the species. It was introduced to Europe to contain the indigenous malaria in Europe, and was later exported to many other colonies throughout the European empires to treat malaria patients. Another important reason was the search for new crops or economically valuable species. Here you can see the gum tree, Hevea brasiliensis. I'll talk about this a bit later as well, which was very important for gum production. And in the beginning, it's native to Latin America, where 98% of gum production originated back then, leading to the boom of Manaus and Para, so today's Belém in Brazil, and the economic boom in these regions. Very important, of course, for the production of raincoats, V-belts, rollers, and so on. We all know it. And the final main reason to exchange plants was, of course, aesthetical reasons. We all know or like the very nice horticultural plants. Here you can see the common or the Japanese camellia, Camellia japonica, as the name says, native to Japan and Taiwan, which was first introduced to Great Britain around 1730. And some of you might know it very well. It's a very famous plant among plant breeders, especially in Great Britain, where, for example, in 1823, the rose-filled variety Elegans was bred, which is a very famous one. It's also used in literature. So Alexandre Dumas used the camellia in his work, The Lady of the Camellias. So it's really an important reason of introduction for these plants, as they were taken up in horticultural and society and literature. As a botanist working in Vienna, I also want to mention the foxglove tree or empress tree. In Austria, it's called the Kaiserbaum or emperor tree. Paulovnia tomentosa, introduced 1835 to Europe by a Japanologist, Franz von Siebold, a German, and it's named after the Dutch Empress Anna Paulovnia. Why do I mention this as a botanist working in Austria? It was the favorite tree of Emperor Franz Joseph I. So he planted it quite widespread and along the empire, and we can still see historic big individuals in Viennese public parks, castles, and other representative areas. But not only these uses are relevant to understand how plants were distributed across the empires, but also plant redistribution in the European empires really gained momentum due to the institutionalization of the plant trade. And this was mainly based on the work done in botanical gardens, but also so-called acclimatization societies and the work of famous plant hunters. And I'm going to talk a bit about these three pillars of the institutionalization of the plant trade during that time. Botanical gardens, we all know them. They were very important, especially in the British Empire. Here's an example map from this very nice study by Brockway, where you can see important botanical gardens of the British Empire in the South Atlantic. On top, we see Kew Gardens. It's a picture from 1943. Kew Garden, founded very early in 1759 by Princess Augusta, which is still today among the most influential, if not the most influential garden today. Another one I want to mention is the Calcutta Botanical Garden. This is a picture from the entrance in 1850, it was founded in 1787 by Robert Kidd, an army officer of the British East India Company. And the last one was also a very nice photograph of the St. Vincent Botanical Garden, so in the Caribbean. Picture is from 1825, but actually the Botanical Garden was founded in 1765 and is one of the oldest botanical gardens in the Western Hemisphere. Key duties of botanical gardens during the European empires were the test, cultivation, and transport of plants with economic benefits mainly in the beginning. And in 1759, for example, Kew began with its cultivation of tropical crops and medical plants from the tropics, especially cinchona, sugar, tea, and other species. In 1840, this was also strengthened after the appointment of William Jackson Hooker as director, who then founded the Museum of Economic Botany in 1845, strengthening even more the cultivation, test, and transport of plants with economic benefits. Another key area was scientific research and also the collection and exchange of plants and plant material, mainly seeds. As an example, in 1876, British adventurer Henry Wickham sent around 70,000 gum tree, Hevea brasiliensis seeds, to Joseph Hooker at Kew, from which they then sent 2,000 seedlings to Sri Lanka to establish the first gum tree plantation in Asia. As already mentioned, one of the second big institutions were acclimatization societies. Acclimatization societies were particularly relevant or influential in the French and British Empire. And just as a figure, around 1900, there were roughly 50 acclimatization societies worldwide, so quite a big number. They were founded for several reasons. So one of the aims was to strengthen the exchange of useful and aesthetically appealing flora and fauna and foster scientific curiosity, but also, which was another very important point, the satisfaction of the desire for exotic species, especially in the upper class. And I have a very nice picture here, which is not on plants, but I think it illustrates this point still quite nicely. We can see here a picture of the boardwalk at the Jardin d'Acclimatation du Bois de Boulogne in Paris, which is quite interesting to see. And I think it's quite a sight if you were walking along this boardwalk to be overtaken by this carriage pulled by an ostrich. So this kind of gives an illustration of this dimension and this desire for exotic species, especially in the upper class back in these days. And this as an important driver of plant and species redistribution during the European empires. Also, the paradigm of these acclimatization societies back in the days where nature was considered to be predominantly malleable or perfect, but it was seen as reshapable. And also these acclimatization societies catered to this imperial hubris of the European powers, to have power over nature and also to foster this Europeanization of the new world, which of course we know nowadays that this is a very critical and but incorrect view of nature, of course. Nevertheless, these acclimatization societies back then had strong societal relevance and were in close exchange with natural history museums, agricultural or botanical societies. Finally, to mention them, plant hunters. Plant hunters mainly were individuals that searched for or collected plant specimen and plant material during targeted voyages and excursions. The idea was to hunt for economically relevant species of plant material or also aesthetically pleasing species. I already talked about him briefly. Henry Wickham, the person who sent Hevea brasiliensis seeds, so gum tree or rubber tree seeds, to Joseph Hooker at Kew, which then led to the first gum tree plantation in Asia. These seeds were obtained by Henry Wickham illegally, and it led, and this establishment of gum tree plantation in Asia then led to the collapse of the Brazilian market in rubber, because rubber could be produced more cost efficiently in Asian regions. Another person or another plant hunter I want to mention was Ernest Henry Wilson, who set out to explore and research on the Chinese flora for the European market. And one species we have in Europe, thanks to him, is the handkerchief or duff tree, Davidia involucrata. You probably all know it or have seen it. It's this very beautiful tree which has these two unevenly sized white bracts resembling handkerchiefs or doves, which was what was and still is a very famous ornamental tree in parks and gardens. Also, as a final point, I want to make technological innovations very strongly shaped the exchange of plants and plant materials in the European empires. So technological process especially increased the survival rates of transported plants on long voyages. One of these big inventions was the Wardian case in 1833, which is basically a small terrarium to transport plant specimen and helps to protect them from dehydration and saltwater on these long voyages. Joseph Dalton Hooker was among the first plant hunters to use a Wardian case. So here are also some other examples. And the first documented shipment of plants in a Wardian case was from New Zealand by Joseph Hooker to Great Britain in a Wardian case. Subsequently, Kew used them very frequently, and the default size of these Wardian cases holds about 28 plants. Another technological innovation was, of course, the invention of steam engine boats and improved navigation techniques. 1820 or 1819 was the first transatlantic voyage by the Savannah. You can see the boat here. It was a hybrid ship with sails and steam engine. And a fun anecdote of the Savannah, who made the first transoceanic travel, was that the operators had so little confidence in the ship that they sent it on its voyage with minimum crew and no cargo, because they were not very convinced that it might make this voyage. We all know that it did, and that steam engine boats revolutionized these travels. Transoceanic travel times were roughly cut in half, resulting in a reduction of costs in goods and commodities and increasing survival rates of plants and plant specimens on these voyages. Just as a brief side note, the dimensions of shipping from Kew Gardens, for example, between 1871 and 1880, yearly outgoing specimens or plant material from Kew encompassed 39 Wardian cases, almost 3,500 seed packets out to 169 recipients. So really widespread distribution of plant and plant material across the world at a yearly basis. So, but why do we still care about this? If we're thinking about how alien plants or non-native plants are distributed nowadays, we could also pose the question, aren't more recent dynamics superimposing on those historic effects, given that globalization has increased at such a pace? And this is something we explored in this publication, which was basically the reason, I think, why I was invited to give this talk today. And I will walk you through some of these findings from the publication here. So what we did in this paper, we looked at the current non-native plant distribution using the GLONASS data that I introduced before, where we have information on the identity of non-native naturalized plants in different regions of the world. We then collected important recent drivers. So we looked at environmental factors, socioeconomic developments, climatic variables, population density, land use variables to try to explain these patterns. But we also included information on the colonial history of these regions. And for that, we looked at 4 different European empires, the British, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch Empire. And we looked at which of the regions worldwide have a history of occupation by the respective power and how long the region was occupied. With this data, then, we looked at the compositional similarity between the non-native floras of these regions as we observe them today. In a short schematic, again, we have these regions A, B, and C. And of course, we have some regions which have a shared common European history of occupation here, for example, region A and region C. And the assumption here is that, for example, trade between regions that were occupied by the same empire was approximately 2.5 times higher than the exchange with regions that were not occupied by that specific empire. This is, of course, depending on restrictive market strategies and trade, that how it was organized within the respective empire, with the Dutch, for example, having a bit of a more open door strategy, and the British, in many cases, a rather closed or preferential market strategy. So we would assume that within the empire, this trade is a lot higher, which is also shown in economic theory, and that these regions have a more or a higher similarity in the non-native floras we see today. The hypothesis we posed: regions formerly occupied by the same European powers show greater similarity in naturalized floras. Regions occupied by a power for longer periods of times will, on average, have more similar naturalized floras to other regions occupied by the same power. And also regions of a specific important strategic role for the occupying power, so military or economic relevance, share more of the naturalized alien floras with other regions, because we assume higher visitation rates, higher introduction of species, deliberately or accidentally. To look at this first hypothesis, what we did is we looked at the observed empire and calculated mean pairwise similarities between any number of regions using the concept of zeta diversity. So we looked at pairs and 3 regions, 4 regions of these empires and calculated mean pairwise similarities of all these combinations. We did this for the regions that we know were occupied by the empires back then, and compared them to random empires of the same size and extent. So basically what we did is we drew random regions from this global pool of regions that we looked at. So the same number of mainland and island regions in these broader geospatial regions, so the same number of regions in sub-Saharan Africa, but randomly. And so we created these kind of null models and compared how similarity changed between the observed and the randomized draws or the randomly constructed empires. So we then calculated this mean floristic similarity between formerly occupied regions of the true and random empires. As I said, we used the zeta diversity concept, and here I explain a bit how this figure here works. So we have here on the y-axis, we have the zeta ratio or retention rate, and the retention rate is the probability that a species, so a non-native species, remains within the naturalized flora of each region, sequentially added to the particular empire. So if we are looking at 2 regions, it's the probability that we find the same non-native plant if we add a 3rd region. The zeta order here is the number of regions that we are comparing. So the mean pairwise similarity of 2 regions, of 3, of 4, and so on. We're looking at the results for the British Empire here. We see this increase in similarity, and in blue, we see the observed empire or the results for the observed empire, and in gray, the results for the randomized empires. Then what we can get from this is that the naturalized floras are always more similar in the observed empire compared to the random draws. But also is very interesting here in the British cases that we have this very stable tail, which indicates a very high retention rate across the full or large parts of the empire, indicating that there is a high degree of homogenization in the non-native floras across many regions of the empire, which makes sense because the British Empire was by far the largest empire. So we have regions across all climatic zones as well. But it was also established more recently than the Spanish or Portuguese empires, starting in the early 17th century and lasting until the 20th century, which means that during that time we had significantly changes in global trade patterns, transportation, as well the invention of steam engine shipping and so on. So we found that we can confirm this hypothesis in our publication. So in the next step, we asked what drives these patterns of similarity in the naturalized floras. What we see here is we will have on the y-axis the turnover we see among species, and on the x-axis we have the predictor range of the specific predictor we're looking at. So for example, climate. What we can see here is in this, so what we see here, this line has two features. One is the amplitude here on the right. So the amplitude indicates the relative importance of the predictor compared to other predictors. So if the amplitude is high, the predictor we find is more important in explaining the current patterns than others. And the slope here shows that changes in the slope of the spline we fitted using generalized dissimilarity models indicates differences in the influence of this predictor on turnover across the predictor range. So for example, here we have a larger impact on turnover between R1 and R2 than compared to R3 and R4, given this, the predictor range change between the two regions stays the same. What this means here in the British Empire, we get a plot which looks like this. So we have turnover here and the predictor range is here, and the colors indicate different drivers we were looking at. And just to summarize this, to make it a bit easier to grasp, these upper three drivers relate to environmental factors, mainly geographic distance and climate, explaining where we find similar non-native floras, which makes sense because if climatic similarities between regions are higher, then of course the species that we can find there are more likely to be the same. But what was more important or more interesting to see is here, these two splines here are related to current socioeconomic developments like GDP, per capita GDP, but also colonial history, and in this case, occupation time, so the time how long a region was occupied by the same power. And this is very interesting because it indicates that these historic predictors are still equally important than the recent ones we find today. So we can sum this up as floristic similarity increases with longer occupation times. And surprisingly, we find that this colonial history of a region, so its affiliation to a specific empire and its occupation time by a European empire, is still equally important in explaining non-native flora similarity that we see today. And it's equally important as current socioeconomic circumstances. So we can also accept this hypothesis that there is a higher similarity in regions that were once occupied by the same power and for longer periods of time. In a final step, then we looked at the regions of important strategic role of the occupying power and if they share more of their naturalized alien floras with other regions. And we did this through network analyses where based on a network where the connections are weighted by the pairwise similarity of the two regions of the non-native alien floras and the edges indicating these individual regions. What we did is we did a cluster analysis clustering these species which are especially similar, which you can see here in the colors, which cluster generally based on geography and climate. And also we did a centrality analysis where we identified regions within these clusters that are especially well connected. So these are the ones which you can see here with the names. And the idea is that a central position in the empire relates to a specific importance of this region in the historic empire back in the time. So trade hubs or regions of strategic relevance. For the Portuguese Empire here, as the example, this makes sense, as for the other four as well in large parts. Here we see the Indo-Malay region being very indicated as an important region, as it was the center of the Portuguese space trade. Also, the important colonies here in Mozambique for the production of and export of sisal, cotton, and sugar. We see the center or these important regions in Brazil, where Bahia was the administrative center of the South American colonies back then. And also what makes sense is finding islands like the Azores or St. Helena down here, which were important stopover destinations for transatlantic voyages. So we can say that, but also we see in this networks that other regions pop up. Here, for example, Zhejiang in China, which back then was not as important as other regions, so it doesn't really fit in the argumentation of the slide before. But it makes sense that this region pops up because if we're looking at Zhejiang today, we get a picture like this, where we have the Ningbo Zhujiang port, which is the third largest commercial port of the world. So it's a big entry up of species and accidentally and deliberately being introduced to these regions as there's a lot of commodity and trade going on. So we can say to some degree we can accept this hypothesis. However, we cannot really formally test them at the moment because we cannot really explain these links between regions because we're lacking historic trade information, for example, or importance of these regions as they actually were. But the patterns we find do actually make sense. So what can we get from all this? So some kind of outlook or lessons for the future. As we know, our world gets more and more connected. I showed you this figure before, and also there have been studies, for example, this nice one, which we did together with Hanno Sebens in 2017, where we see that every year new non-native species are recorded globally for the first time. So this first record rate here, this is not only for plants, but this trend is increasing and even accelerating until today. So it's still a big issue that we're finding more and more non-native species as well for the first time. From our studies and what we see from other studies as well, we still today have these post-colonial dependencies and new linkages. So our study showed that even today, centuries later, we still see the effects of European colonial history on the plant world. Also, we see that the global trade network is becoming more and more dense, which is increasing the amount of species that are transported accidentally or deliberately. For example, global trade volume has increased after the Second World War by a factor of 30 until 1950. Also, traveling times have been reduced dramatically, which also increased the probability that species survive these long journeys. For example, nowadays we can fly non-stop from Frankfurt to Tokyo in 13 hours. So the probability of a species surviving such a trip is higher. Also, nowadays we still have historical post-colonial dependencies and structures that are still remaining. One very important one is language. European languages are still often lingua franca in many regions. So we can see it here where we have European languages spoken as official languages globally. And this also economic theory shows that common languages still drive preferential trade and exchange between regions. Finally, we are creating new dependencies and preferential trade agreements that are establishing or expanding, like the free trade agreements or transoceanic free trade treaties that we're seeing today. Why should we care about all this? Coming to an end of the talk. As I said initially, a subset of non-native species, invasive species, have strong negative impacts on biodiversity, nature's contribution to people or human livelihood. Here as an example, Robinia, Pseudoacacia, which replaces native species in Europe, changes entire ecosystems through the nitrogen fixation in these regions, for example. But also we have species like Ambrosia, Artemisifolia, or ragweed, or Heracleum mantegatianum, which cause allergies or phototoxic reactions. So they really directly impact people and human livelihoods. Also, a study that we conducted shows that under business as usual projections, we will see a strong increase in non-native species or established non-native species until 2050 if we are interpolating historic trends into the future. And we see this for all kinds of different taxonomic groups, and on average we find that a 36% relative increase between 2005 and 2050 in the models, which would, for example, amount to an increase of 2,543 species projected for Europe in 2050. Also, invasive species cause huge economic costs. There was this very big and interesting project InvaCost, which is still ongoing, which showed that we find $163 billion globally in costs in 2017 caused by biological invasions, which is a conservative estimate. For Europe, this is estimated at 20 billion euros for 2013. Finally, we see in many studies that prevention is better than cure. So it is still difficult to predict the invasion potential or the invasive potential of individual species, because this is depending on many different factors. We find certain traits and characteristics which increase the likelihood, but still predicting the invasion potential is difficult. And also we find that management costs increase by a factor of around 40 for established and widespread non-native species. So if we act early, we reduce the cost, and we of course reduce the likelihood and the manageability of reducing unwanted impacts of non-native invasive species. With that, I hope you enjoyed the talk. I want to thank all of you for the interest. I really want to thank the Linnean Society for this invitation. I invite you to get in touch if you have questions that we cannot address now. And I want to thank the great team of people around me in the GLONAF project, in our working group in Vienna, and the funding bodies which helped me or supported me in doing the research I did over the last years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Bernd. I hope everybody was able to hear it all and there wasn't any connection problems. We will be putting the talk up on our online channel on YouTube at a later date. I just actually want to say one quick thing, I do promise. You touched upon this early on, and actually, and then something that didn't really appear later on, but I feel very passionate about personally, is when people often ask, why should we care about invasive species? You enumerated very, very clearly the core things for many people. But just wanted to return to a point you made very early on, is actually part of the reason we should care about invasive species, and particularly ones that cause serious damage, is there is the process of biological erosion, which actually erodes cultural diversity as well. We as societies are born from our landscapes and our environments that created our communities and our identity. And globally, that loss of specialness is something that we should all feel very, very worried about, as well as the things that we can enumerate in many ways. So thank you very much for that, Bernd. I'm going to dive into the Q&A and pull out a few questions for you.
Yes, thank you.
So we have one from Katja Hugard and says, hi, Dr. Lenzner, can you comment on the distribution of plants in Germany's former colonies? I noticed the areas of Africa that Germany colonized didn't have such dramatically altered flora as in other places. Thank you for the fantastic talk.
Thank you. That's a very interesting point. Unfortunately, I cannot say too much about the German Empire so far, because we focused on these 4 large empires, which was quite tedious already to collect such information. When we started with the project, I was really surprised that really getting information on occupation time at the lower level than state was quite difficult. Also, some of you might have noticed that we did not include the French Empire in our analyses, which is also a pity, but this also relates maybe to the question, because we excluded the French Empire here because also the data availability on non-native or naturalized plant information in GLONASS is very gappy in many African regions, also many African regions below the Sahara, which is a pity, because this some data gaps we are still trying to fill, and we're working with local experts on filling these, but this also prohibits us from drawing robust conclusions on how these patterns look down there and what could have been the driving factors. So I'm sorry, I cannot really elaborate or answer your question here.
Thank you. It actually kind of partially reflects a comment that was made a couple of times through in the chat. Please put your questions in the Q&A, folks, regarding data biases, about how you could accommodate and adjust for bias in data from certain regions not having information available, possibly because of resources. How did you address that with the empires that you dealt with?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. One thing I can encourage people who are interested in this relating to the publication is to look into the reviewer comments, because it seems like all of you could have been reviewers on our publication. We answered or tried to answer these in the revisions, and they are of course nicely published alongside the paper, which is something Nature does nowadays, which is very nice. Given the data biases in GLONASS, since this is a quite big community effort where we are in touch with the local experts, we have some qualitative assessments on the robustness or the completeness of the study, or the completeness of the alien floras within GLONASS. So what we did is we mainly concentrated on these regions where we have a moderate to high certainty that these floras are as complete as possible, and neglected those where we don't have robust information. So this is at the moment, unfortunately, the best we can do, but we're trying, of course, to fill these gaps. We are, as I said, working with local experts. We're trying to update the database wherever possible, and of course, then try to base new analyses on these more robust data at some point. But you've seen, of course, in the publications, there are a lot of gray areas we can still see, or in some regions or some parts of the world, we have better information at the subnational regions and then in other, and all these things, of course, bias or limit the conclusion we can draw from some of the studies, but overall they seem to be robust.
Yeah. So Michael Wilpers asked, has the number of neophytes traveling from Japan been essentially reduced by its long isolation from trade with Europe and the Americas, as it essentially did not open to the West until the mid-19th century? Any thoughts or comments on that?
That's an excellent question, which probably would be better suited to a person working on the Japanese flora. As a general statement, maybe I would say that we have seen, or this is also one of the outcomes of our study, is that we see these higher similarity due to restricted markets and restricted exchange of commodities or species within regions. So based on this, I would also assume that if a region has a very restricted policy in trading, then this, of course, affects which species are exchanged or not. Japan also might have a more special role because it's an island. We know this nowadays, for example, from New Zealand, who have very strong biosecurity regulations, for example. And being an island also has the advantage that you can more easily control what is coming in and what is going out, because you have these clear points of entry in harbors, in airports, and so on. So I would say that there's, in my opinion, should have a strong effect on which species you will find, giving the relationship to preferential trading partners. But again, I cannot say any specifics.
Yeah, one thing occurred to me when I first read that question was, one of the things also about Japan is that it's opening up somewhat forcefully, was actually more or less concurrent with the huge initial expansion in global trade. And in many ways, that data would probably mirror that large bulk date expansion in non-native species globally as well. So you might find, I would suspect, I'm statistically rubbish, frankly, when it comes to things like this, that it may well actually be in part of that large curve, to put it in crude terms.
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
I would expect the same.
Yeah. Now, I'm just quickly reading one. Actually, it's Mike Dempsey asked this, but it's his question. I'm just going to put it to you again, because see if there's other things that come to your mind. And it's essentially around data and data smoothing and homogenization. How much many of the data on species transfer or homogenization are skewed by the amount of data collection in each region or country? And then in brackets, some countries do more research than others.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and a very common problem in doing macroecological analyses. So, for example, I showed you this global map in the beginning of the coverage of the GLONASS data we have, and in a very nice publication led by Wayne Dawson, who's at Durham University, who analyzed these patterns. We did a hotspot analysis, identifying hot and cold spots of numbers of naturalized plants worldwide. So I encourage you to look at this. And one way we tried to account for data biases there was to correct these by including a sampling bias term in our models. And this we derived based on GBIF data. We all know GBIF also has a lot of gaps and biases. So we derived a proxy of sampling bias based on the reporting in GBIF. So we have this clear over-reporting patterns in Europe, in Central America, in more economically strong regions, and the other way around, in less economically strong regions, we see a strong undersampling. So factoring these proxies into the models, we can see how much of the variation in the data can be explained through those, essentially having an idea or factoring out these sampling biases to some degree, and being more robust or more certain on which drivers really lead to the patterns we're observing today. This is, of course, not optimal, but it's the way we can try to account for these, and then, of course, need to be careful in the conclusions we're drawing.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things about this is it's also very clear, just when even looking roughly to the map, where you look at the data richness, that there is a strong bias, for example, towards the Anglosphere, and New Zealand and Australia stand out as being particularly rich data sources. And those are two countries with extraordinary biodiversity, which have been massively impacted by invasive species. And therefore, as a consequence, there's an extremely important and rich data from those countries because of those issues, which does put quite a strong sort of bias into the data sets.
Yes, of course, when we're working with plants, we also have this disadvantage of not having very good proxy data or information on introduction efforts or propagate pressure. So how many species are introduced, how frequently. So that's something where you can always be jealous about data on birds, where such information is more readily provided. But I also think that especially these European historic empires could be one avenue to explore this information, because there are really rich data information hidden in historical data or in archives of these big trade companies back in the days, where they have meticulously collected information on the number of seeds, commodity values, as well with shipping lanes, initial port, destination ports. So trying to mobilize these information would be amazing, and I would be really happy to look into this. So if there are any empire historians or economic historians working on the European empires, feel free to get in touch. It would be amazing to try and figure out ways to mobilize such data.
Yeah, I think, you know, for example, the Caribbean, there's lots of questions, for example, about the native status of many species in the Caribbean because of the nature of the Atlantic slave trade and the impacts on the people that were moved and traded through this awful activity. And the plants that were moved as well. And because it happened kind of in an early sort of kind of, in many cases, kind of robust, for want of a better word, data framework, it's very hard to understand in places like the Caribbean what the kind of introduced ranges are for many plants.
Yeah, for that also these pollen analyses information that I presented early in the talk are super interesting to see, because I mean, I of course showed you some of the examples where it works very nicely, but if you will have a look at the paper once it's published, you can see that there are also islands where these coinciding trends are not as clear. And there, of course, it will be interesting to look more into detail why this is the case. Is this due to the attribution of the native alien or native non-native status, or is this based on the gap information on first human arrival or settlements? But having such resources or mobilizing such resources as pollen data is, of course, very interesting to get an even better glimpse into these even more longer term information or trends that we can see today.
So I'm going to move slightly into a slightly different realm of questioning from Caroline Weston. I'm not entirely clear partly what she's driving at this question's about. I'm going to assume that it relates to purposeful genetic modification. So, you know, it's a manner of sort of working with doing gene modification, for example. As these kind of gene modifications, alterations, is there anything tracking through and research about how these things are potentially moving around globally in sort of underneath and within that neophyte global movement?
I have to say I'm unfortunately not aware of such information, because it's also very far away from my expertise. So I would be very much out of my comfort zone to give.
Me too. I was going to ask the question on behalf of, you know, but I had a suspicion that would probably be the case. I think at the moment what's fair to say is that we still, you know, relatively little is known about rates of gene transfer at anything more than, say, a kind of localized level, or possibly, you know, within region. I don't think as yet there's really significant evidence of sort of transcontinental large-scale global movement, as far as I'm aware, either. But it is certainly a question of importance and interest into the future. One of the things I'm actually going to just mention about genetic modification is actually about gene adaptation. One of the things we also do know is that non-native species, both non-invasive and invasive, very often go through quite significant genetic adaptation and shifts in their genome because of the new environments they live in. And there are multiple examples of how living in a new place can make the organism in some respects quite different to where it was in the first place. Yes. Actually, somebody asked this question, again, this is Michael Wilpers. Did you look at countries that have never been colonized by the European colonial powers, for example, Thailand, or more recently Belize, in terms of looking at actually if there was a significance? I'm assuming you took that into consideration through your randomized protocols, but you didn't look specifically at individual regions.
Yeah, no, we did not do this at this point. This would be a very interesting idea or very interesting thing to look at. But then again, it's also a question that we would need to take into account is the history of these regions in a different context. What we initially thought about looking at, which would have been very nice, would be to compare historical colonial empires, European empires with non-European empires, but they're also getting information is quite difficult, and also many of the the non-European colonial empires at that time were considerably smaller or shorter, so the trend comparison would be a bit more difficult. And looking at continental empires like the Ottoman Empire, for example, would also be super interesting. But the dynamics here are also a lot different because the transportation was more on the continental scale of connected regions. So also there would be a lot of difficulties in disentangling neophytes and archaeophytes and the history of distribution of species along these empires. So unfortunately, we did not look into this at this point, and it's probably quite difficult to realize, I guess.
As is often the way with these kind of things, all of a sudden lots of questions coming in, and I don't think we're going to be able to answer them. I'm actually going to ask this one on behalf of Michelle Nichol, because it actually ties into what we were having a brief chat about beforehand and is very important in the context of where we are globally at the moment. Have any studies been made as to how climate change could potentially affect the impact of non-native species globally?
That's a very good point, and this relates a bit to one of the holy grails in projecting non-native species into the future and projecting impacts into the future. There have been studies that try to attempt this. For example, at the European scale, there has been a study, I think last year, by Belinda Gallardo and colleagues, where they looked at they projected non-native species into the future and related those to their impacts on nature's contribution to people. So there are initiatives to do this. I know that within the INVACOS project, where they're collecting this monetary or economic impact information of invasive non-native species, they are trying to look into projecting these into the future, but it is quite tricky to really project impacts, especially at the local scale from distribution modeling data or these kinds of information. So we would like to look into this also in the future in some more detail, but there will be certainly a lot of innovation, modeling approaches and studies still be necessary to look into this more.
Katja Haugaard, and once again, I'm going to actually put this question forward because I really like it. I think it's really interesting myself, is the Inca Empire would be a great choice for a non-Western colonial empire that spread plants around to possibly run a comparable study on?
I agree.
Katja, you've got a research project.
Yes, I'm happy for any further up collaborations. I think this is very interesting. I think it's always tricky or difficult to think about which data is appropriate to answering these questions. Also, I mean, I touched upon this in the last, related to the last hypothesis and the historical networks we have. It seems like we can confirm this hypothesis based on these pattern analyses, but also this is correlation patterns. We don't have any opportunity to test these. And also in our study, we're looking at the recent naturalized floras we see today. So we don't have any information for the species at the regional scale if they have actually been introduced during the time of occupation or afterwards. So there are considerable shortcomings, and I guess the more back in time we are going, and the more we are going to region where data even today are scarce, the more problematic it will probably get to get robust results. So if you have data, I'm more than happy to discuss this and think of a project, but I think it's quite tricky in some instances.
Probably going to have to be almost the last one, or last but one, from Carlos Leonbach. Great talk, thanks. Was any plant family in particular that came out as the most invasive or more invasive? Which plant family or families? Maybe there was a cohort of 2 or 3 that.
So in this study, we did not look into individual plant families.
Yeah.
The next step, or in the follow-up, what we want to do is we want to look into the individual species and relate them also to their economical uses, or the economic uses they have been attributed today and back in the day. So it's something that is hopefully coming up at some point in the near future. Looking at the recent distribution of the naturalized floras, I really recommend looking into the publication by Petr Pišek on the naturalized alien floras database. It's a Preslia paper. I think it's 50 pages, and there is all you can ever wonder about knowing the CLONAF database, which species are most widespread, which families are overrepresented or not. So I invite you to have a look at that.
Pišek's publications are core and seminal in many ways for invasive species work. Absolutely, I agree with you. I'm terribly sorry, folks. I'm not going to be able to squeeze any more questions in. I do hope you found this evening's lecture and presentation talk. And it's a pleasure for me personally to meet Bernd Lenzner on the line and to see the man face to face and after having read multiples of your publications. And I would like to wish you all well and a good evening or morning wherever you are in the world. And please do join us again sometime in the near future for our next seminar. So
thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.